In this video, I'll tell you about the new Imperial Knight and Chaos Knight combat patrols for Warhammer 40,000, and why they're the cheapest combat patrols by far, like more than $70 cheaper. Going to start with a little bit of history. Back in the early spring of 2023, Games Workshop announced the 10th edition of Warhammer 40,000. One of the newer features that they talked about during the big preview event, which was held at Adepticon, was the new format of play, Combat Patrol. This was a format designed to help get more people into the game of 40K by helping them to buy a Combat Patrol box for whatever force they wanted, build it as the free list that they downloaded from the Warhammer community website told them to, right? And then learn to start playing 40K all with this smaller force. It was a pretty smart plan, I think, generally. It allowed you, as a new player, to have, the fun part, the models, picking out which models you want, and then buying that box. And then you could then download the rules bits for free and not have to worry about buying the rules as well. You just spend your money on the fun bits and, download the not as fun bits. GW committed to the rules being free for Combat Patrol and have so far mostly stuck to their word, but more about that in a sec. I remember at the time being pretty excited for this. Even though I didn't need to be, introduced to Warhammer 40K at this point, I still understood the fun possibilities of playing 40K but with fewer models and the benefits of being given the list to build. There's no analysis paralysis of list building, which is really nice for some folks. So the next day after the GW preview presentation thing at Adepticon, I went and bought a Deathwatch Combat Patrol in the vendor hall there at Adepticon. Once I got home, I built it and then started painting it. I went on to build and paint several more combat patrols after the Deathwatch group. The Space Marines from the Leviathan box set that came out at the beginning of 10th there. The Imperial Guard, which I just touched up the paint job on in a recent video, Pachow. There were the Necrons, some of which I had already painted from the 9th edition Indominus launch box for 40K way some time ago, 3 years previously. And then I got about halfway done with the Dark Angels Combat Patrol before kinda losing steam, if I'm honest. I may have lost some steam, but Games Workshop didn't. They produced new Combat Patrol boxes as they kind of updated the codices throughout, 10th edition. When 10th edition launched, it was an index for everybody. Everybody got those indexes, which they could download free or they could buy the cards. But then every time they made a new actual codex and got rid of the indexes, it generally also came with a Combat Patrol that you could buy at the same time. The old Combat Patrol boxes that were available at the beginning of the 10th edition were still technically legal to play as they were replaced by the newer Combat Patrol boxes, but the old boxes were no longer produced or sold unless you could find an old one sitting on a shelf at your local shop. I kind of preferred many of the original Combat Patrol boxes. The new ones that have been coming out have been mainly just kind of a big box of troops, oops, all Space Marines, right? And the original boxes had some kind of big robots or even a few vehicles in them. It was just more fun for me to paint. Eventually, somewhere around, I think the start of 2024, they started releasing new Combat Patrol lists in White Dwarf magazine. Now, these were not free, of course, because you need to buy White Dwarf to get them. However, they'd eventually, many months later, right, end up for free download on the Warhammer community website. So they were still, GW was still technically holding on to their promise that the Combat Patrol rules and lists would be free. But if you wanted some of them a little bit earlier, then you kind of ended up buying a copy of White Dwarf. These Combat Patrols in the White Dwarf were just the lists of the forces and their other specific rules and stratagems and all that stuff like that. You still needed to figure out how to get the models yourself, as it wasn't like a boxed Combat Patrol set that you could just buy. It was just like a list, and then you kind of had to source the models yourself. You might have already had the figures in your collection. That's a possibility. Or maybe you bought the models that you either didn't have yet or whatever, you bought them new or used, or maybe you even just proxied other models from other companies or kit bash stuff or whatever to get the right combination of models needed to represent the Combat Patrol list from the magazine. The biggest issue I saw with Combat Patrol was that it still wasn't particularly cheap to get into. When first launched, I think the Combat Patrol boxes were $160 US. Now they're like $168 to $170 depending on the set. Now that's certainly cheaper than, a full 2,000 point 40K army, to be sure. And most of the boxes, right, at that cost, the Combat Patrol boxes, they were a savings in comparison to buying all of the parts separately at retail. There was a volume discount for buying a Combat Patrol versus buying all the stuff that's in the Combat Patrol separately. But it is still kind of a big ask for someone who's thinking about getting into Warhammer 40K via Combat Patrol, and Combat Patrol is designed to bring in new players. Well, now there's a considerably cheaper way to get into Combat Patrol if you want, and especially if you like big robots. In the most recent issue of White Dwarf, which is I think issue 509 as of this recording, there's Combat Patrol lists for knights, both Loyalist knights and Chaos knights. Each list is just 2 robots, right? They're not really robots, but you know what I mean. The Armigers for the Imperium and the War Dogs for the Forces of Chaos. The benefit is that both of those units currently come 2 to a box. So if you buy an Armiger box or a War Dogs box, you'll be all set with everything you need in just one box, just like the regular Combat Patrol boxes. Also, the price is much cheaper than a normal Combat Patrol box. Like I said, normal Combat Patrol boxes are like $168 to $170 American, but a box of Armigers or War Dogs costs $94.50, which is about $73 to $75 cheaper. If you want to hop on board right away, then you'll also need, of course, a copy of White Dwarf number 509, which is like $12 in the States or whatever. But that's still a pretty massive discount overall when you look at it in comparison to a normal Combat Patrol box. And it's not just one list in that magazine, it's 2 lists. You can choose whether you want to be Imperium or Chaos, depending on the models that you buy. Now, it wouldn't be Games Workshop if there wasn't a but. In this case, it's this. The Armiger and War Dog Combat Patrols are really neat and considerably cheaper, but both kits are currently marked as temporarily out of stock on the GW US website. They were temporarily out of stock the day that this issue of White Dwarf was released, so I don't know that it was like a run on the models due to the release of the magazine. I'm pretty sure it's just GW's supply issues lately, but you'd think that they would have kind of planned ahead some since that they knew that this issue of White Dwarf was on its way. I mentioned this US website stock problem on Blue Sky, and I got information from people that lived outside the US that the Armigers and the War Dogs were still available on some of the GW websites from other countries, so they're not completely out worldwide. Also, there's always your local games store, which is where you should check first if you can in most situations anyway. Luckily, I already had the Armigers box sitting on, in my basement on a shelf. I had purchased it because at the beginning of 10th edition 40K, I was going to build out my Imperial Guard Combat Patrol into a full 1,000 point force. My plan then was to add a single Armiger to my Imperial Guard force as an Imperial Knights ally. However, it never really ended up happening because there wasn't really anyone around me interested in playing 1,000 point lists and, a host of other issues as well. However, the benefit was that now I had an unopened box of Armigers on my shelf ready to be Imperial Knights, for a Combat Patrol. Unfortunately, I really kind of wanted to do the Chaos War Dogs first. I think they're more interesting from a modeling standpoint, they're more interesting from a paint standpoint, all those kind of things. And those I didn't have downstairs on my shelf, so I went to my local game store. They had the Armigers in stock, but not the War Dogs. They said that they could order them from GW and told me that just because they're marked as temporarily out of stock on the GW US website, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're out of distribution stock for US stores. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in the wargaming industry between manufacturers, distributors, and local stores and more, and how everything kind of works together. That might make a video that might be interesting to a handful of you, maybe, perhaps. I don't know. Let me know down in the comments below if you think so. And lo and behold, about a week later, the War Dogs were delivered to my local store, and they gave me a call, and I went and picked them up. I even got a chance to start building my first Chaos War Dog earlier this week. It had been a minute since I had built a Games Workshop miniature. I've been mostly using like 3D printed miniatures and miniatures from other companies lately, and I'd forgotten how fiddly GW miniatures can be. It'll take me a while to get them ready for paint, I think, but then I'll probably paint them on Twitch when the time comes. You can follow me there on Twitch if you want to. Links down in the description. So if you're interested in the cheapest official combat patrols available for Warhammer 40,000, or you just wanted to finally have an Imperial Knights or Chaos Knights combat patrol, your prayers have been answered. If you're watching this near to the time that it was published, check your local stores or whatever for White Dwarf 509. Maybe you can find it online, I'm not sure. Or if you're watching this video sometime in the future, then maybe check the Warhammer community download section and see if those combat patrols are now available for free download. Do you think that these baby knights will be overpowered in combat patrol, or maybe underpowered due to their, small numbers? They have an OC of 8, so holding an objective won't be super difficult, but with only 2 models, getting the objectives might be kind of tough. Are you going to try to run them, or are they not necessarily for you? Let us all know what you think down in the comments below. If you like this video, then please engage in depressmentation of the like button while you're down there as well, and subscribe to see more videos like this every single Friday. Thanks for watching.